Okay, welcome to research methods. Okay, today we're going to be finishing up the section on research ethics. And we left off talking about deception, and now we're going to talk about informed consent. We were talking about the APA guidelines. Okay, and just to review a little bit, because it looks like we're just, are basically right in the middle here. Remember, there's all these guidelines. We have these tables here. Guidelines, right? You're not allowed to do harm, privacy, confidentiality. You need institutional approval. You need competent researchers doing the actual work. Records need to be kept safe, and there's guidelines about confidentiality. Informed consent, which is a big one. We're going to talk about that in detail. Okay. When you don't need informed consent, when you offer inducements for research, there are guidelines about that, and guidelines about if you use deception. A lot of research involves deception in the last section on debriefing. So we mentioned no harm and we mentioned deception. And so we need to go into now into informed consent, which is a major issue. Informed consent is probably the most important thing, okay? And it's called, so participants need to consent, first of all. They need to agree to participate in your research, especially if you're doing something like an experiment, okay? They need to agree, and it has to be, it's called informed consent for a reason. It's because participants need to know what they're getting into. They have to be informed, okay? Now, I did mention that there are some times when informed consent is not needed. Like, for instance, if you're doing an observation and you're observing things in public, you don't need to tell people, hey, I'm observing you, because then the study wouldn't work. Informed consent is simpler if you're doing something like a survey, okay? So I'm gonna tell you guys about this stuff. But just know that when you guys do your own research, you're going to do a survey, it's not going to really be complicated. You don't really need to develop an informed consent form. You don't really need to seek institutional approval. For you, it's going to be like, hey, you send people an email. You want to participate in my survey? Hey, click on this link over here, something like that. Okay, and if they click on it, that means they're consenting. And you don't, obviously, you're not really going to tell them what the survey is about, because then they're going to, lie to you more than they otherwise would. But what is informed consent? Okay, for informed consent, subjects must be informed, or actually they're called participants. Now, participants must be informed of all available information about the study so they can make a rational decision to participate, or maybe not to participate. They have to make a rational decision. So they have to know what they're getting into. If the information is missing or vague, then it's not really informed consent. They don't really know what they're getting into. And you have to develop what's called a consent form. There's actually a legal document that is prepared where you tell them about the study. And usually these are used for experiments. So you tell them about, let's say, about the experiment, and there's a place for them to sign and date, saying they agree to participate, given what you've told them. Okay. So there's a consent form that's very important that needs to be developed, and it is actually a legal document. And there are similar things, by the way, that you'll probably have to sign for other things, like if you have kids and they have to go, let's say, to a, well, they don't have to, but there's a chance for them to go on a field trip. Let's say if school was, normally open, right? Going to school the way we normally do, the way the kids normally do. You have to, as a parent, you have to sign this, read and sign this consent form for your kid to go on that field trip. And the consent form will say things that will make you uncomfortable if you read it carefully. It said that your kid might get hurt. It even says things like that your kid may die, because this consent form is a legal document and they want to make sure it covers like all these possibilities. It says your kid might get hurt, your kid may die, and it says something, it says right there, something like, you promise not to sue us. Imagine that, right? But don't worry, this is California. You have more rights than you think. I don't know about those other states. When you sign a document like this, you're kind of screwed. But in California, you have rights, okay? And that consent form is there basically to protect the institution, to protect the school, so that you don't, sue them, But even if they're just going on a, on a little, a trip that is really not dangerous. They're going to be getting on a school bus. They're going to be going to some pumpkin patch, like for Halloween or something. They'll make you fill out a form like that or sign a form like that so your kid can go. That's a consent form as well. when you're going to have surgery, like medical surgery, or you're going to get plastic surgery or something like that, you will have to read and sign a consent form. And it says there that you know what's going to happen more or less, and that you basically agree that you know, things may not work out as planned. And if you're having plastic surgery, it's going to say somewhere right there that you may actually look worse after the surgery. If you're going to have real surgery, it'll say something like that you may actually end up worse off, or you may die. And it's all basically to you know, to limit the extent to which you can sue them. But don't worry, you still have a lot of rights here in California. Okay, and if you don't sign that form, by the way, you can't get your plastic surgery, you can't have your surgery. There's also a debriefing that happens after an experiment is over, in which you sit down with participants and you explain to them what really happened. And that's part of informed consent. So they have to read and sign this form and date it. And then there's a part in which, you know, which after that, after the whole thing's over, you sit down with them and you talk with them about what actually happened, because there might still have been some deception. Here are components of an informed consent form. Okay, it is, there are a lot of things involved with informed consent. There's an overview where you present the goals of the study, why it's being done, etc. Right? There's a description of the procedures, you know, what's going to happen. There's risks and inconveniences. There's a place where you describe and outline that, right? That if there are any potential risks, physical or maybe psychological, you describe those. Any potential benefits, right? Benefits to science, or maybe benefits that the participants may gain. Cost and economic consideration. You can also describe, you know, if there's any kind of payment, if the participants really have to pay for anything, or if they get paid, or if there's other benefits to the participants, you know, in which maybe they're testing some drug which could be beneficial and might cure them or reduce their symptoms or something like that. There's stuff like that that could be mentioned as well. Confidentiality, there needs to be a section where you basically say you're going to keep their information private and confidential, that you're really not going to collect any information that really could identify them, and how that's going to be kept under lock and key, or nowadays everything is kept electronically in servers and it's password protected, things like that. This consent form will be several pages long, okay, when you actually do an experiment. It might be 2-3 pages. It depends, but it's a legal document. It's very important. And it's one of those, when you're seeking approval for a study, which usually this is for an experiment, a consent form, when it's something that's really detailed, like an experiment, it'll be really hard to get things approved. They will look at this consent form very carefully. It's one of the more important things. Other ethical issues that can come up, which I mentioned a little bit already when we looked at the table, but here it is again in writing, something we want to emphasize. Confidentiality. So it's item 2 of table 4.2, which lists all the guidelines. You have to keep the participants' information basically private, you know, you have to keep it confidential. That's often ensured through anonymity. Usually you do not record anything like names or social security numbers, or credit card information or addresses or anything like that. You usually don't record anything like that. Usually, I mean, they just, you know, fill something out, or, you know, they go through the experiment and you collect information about them, but usually not that. Now, if you're doing medical research, then there might be other things that could be collected, like medical information, like things about their, you know, their medical history, or maybe even their blood pressure, or if they suffer from certain things. And even all that stuff needs to be kept confidential. The corporations that, you know, that make these products that you guys shop for, they're supposed to keep your information confidential. But as you know, every now and then some corporation gets hacked, and people access, you know, people who shouldn't access your information end up accessing things like credit card numbers and addresses and things like that, and emails, and, you know, that's a breach of confidentiality basically. But when you're doing research, you also have to take things very seriously, and to make it easy, don't collect any information that you shouldn't be collecting. Okay, your survey should not ask for names. If you're going to develop a survey, it should not ask for any names. It should not ask for any addresses. You know, it should not ask for anything like social security numbers or anything like that. You don't need that. Okay, you might ask about things like income, or maybe you know, ethnicity, sex or gender identity, things like that. And all that should be kept confidential, even though it can't really be linked to a specific person, but that's part of the APA guidelines. You might collect information about attitudes and opinions as well, what they believe about, gun control, or attitudes like if they, believe in donating to charities or whatever it is. You can ask about a whole bunch of different things, and some of those things may be sensitive questions. Or measures of performance, might be an IQ test that's involved, or a memory test or something like that. And, all that information should be kept confidential, okay, regardless of how they did, even things that have to do with demographics. But in reality, there shouldn't be any identifying information. You're just collecting information, and you're going to identify your participants by, labeling them by number. This participant number 1, number 2, number 3, you number your surveys or something like that. If you collect them online, then surveys probably still be numbered, but yeah, they're going to be numbered when they go into the database. They're still going to be organized in some way, and the data should be kept together, but there's really no names or any sensitive information that would be able to that if somebody were to access the information, they would be able to identify the person. That wouldn't happen, but you still need to keep the stuff confidential regardless, and keep the information under lock and key or in a server that's password protected. All that is part of the guidelines. Now let's talk about something important. How do we, what's in place to make sure that researchers follow these guidelines? Okay, well, there's something known as the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB. Okay, usually when you do research, you probably work for an institution. It could be, maybe you work at a university like USC or UCLA or something like that, and you do research there. You're faculty and you do research, or maybe you just do research. You're not faculty, but usually faculty also do, faculty usually as part of their job, they teach and they do research. But there's a group of people, and they're known as the Institutional Review Board, and their job is basically to review all the proposals for research. You have to write up a proposal and talk about what you're going to do, what you plan to do. And there's this group of people that looks it over and approves your research. And then after that, once you get approval, then of course you can get started. There's also research institutions like the RAND Corporation or other corporations. They also do research. They should have something similar, some kind of board, some kind of review board, which is just a group of people who sit around a table and look at all the proposals basically and discuss them. So each institution or agency is required to establish an IRB committee, okay? And this committee is composed of scientists and non-scientists. It's important that you have scientists on there who know how research is done, who know and understand what these researchers are talking about when they refer to certain things. So you need experts there in the field, people who are actually scientists or who are familiar with doing research, but you also need non-scientists. It might seem odd that you need people in there who really haven't been trained in science or who don't know much about science. That might seem odd, but the reason you need people in there who are not scientists is because you need an outsider's perspective. You need someone, let's say, who is not as familiar with science, because you need that outside perspective, because to scientists, when they look at a proposal, they might say, oh yeah, this is fine, there's nothing wrong with this. But someone who's not a scientist, who would be more similar to the participant, might say, no, this is not okay. Like, I would not be comfortable doing that. So there's a different perspective. We need the perspective of outsiders as well, just to keep the scientists honest. Because if you just ask scientists, researchers, they will just say a whole bunch of stuff is okay and no big deal, when in fact it is, because we are biased, okay, in our thinking because of our training. So they will examine proposed research involving humans, okay? The Institutional Review Board examines research involving humans, not research involving animals. That's a different committee, okay? And they'll review the research proposals according to 7 criteria. So they look at 7 different things, 7 criteria, and let's look at those. 7 basic criteria are minimization of risk to participants. Have the researchers done enough to minimize risk to participants? If there's drugs involved or alcohol or something like that, or anything where there could be some risk, have the researchers done all they can to make sure participants will not be harmed, or that the risk to harm is minimized? And if there is some risk, is the risk basically reasonable in relation to the benefits? In other words, there's this little bit of risk perhaps, but is that reasonable given the benefits of, let's say, of doing this research, of what might be discovered or what it might lead to? Is it reasonable? There might be some small risk and the benefits could be large of the research, or maybe there's a lot of risk and the benefits of doing the research are minimal, in which case they may not want to approve the research. Equitable selection means that, the way participants are selected or recruited is fair, especially if we're talking about, research on some drug that could have benefits, and there's a lot of people suffering out there. Is it being done equitably? Okay, or are they just picking, people who, let's say, are who they know, or people who they want to benefit? That happens a lot when it comes to jobs and becoming a part of certain prestigious institutions. There's a lot of favoritism that goes on. It's just part of the world we live in any country, by the way. But when it comes to research, we have to be fair. Sometimes the research could be beneficial to the participants, and when you make sure that people are selected fairly. Informed consent we talked about, that's a very important part. They will look at that document, informed consent, very carefully. And they will recommend changes before they approve the study, and they'll really give you a hard time with informed consent. That's what I had the most difficult time with when I was in graduate school, and I did research involving alcohol and aggression, and it took months to get approval. And they hassled me mostly about the informed consent form, because that's where you describe, what participants are going to be going through. Documentation of informed consent. Yes, is there a form, a place for participants to sign and date, right? You need that form. Data monitoring, okay. Who is going to be looking at the data? How would it be monitored? How are you going to keep track of it? And privacy and confidentiality. What are you doing to make sure the information remains private and confidential, right? That the information cannot be linked back to specific individuals. That's confidentiality. And it's going to be kept private, right? It's going to be kept the information on some computer somewhere, on some server that's password protected. Right, nowadays computers come with all these protections, but you still might want to put a password or some kind of passcode if someone should actually, get into the computer and then find a document and they want to open it, they need another password. Okay, things like that. Now, in the past, things were done on with paper and pencil. There's a bunch of actual physical forms that people filled out, and they kept these in these, metal file cabinets that had a lock and key. But often the key was stuck right there, right to the lock, and anyone could just open it and look into it. Technically, that's a violation of the privacy and confidentiality. But I know that researchers aren't always as careful as they could be. I think it's easier to keep things private and confidential when you have things on a computer. But when you have things in physical form, they're just lying around, and anyone could just come into the lab. Assistants, even students that are trying to talk to the professor or whatever it is, might start looking at that stuff. And I've seen, when I was in grad school, I saw stuff laying there that had been there for years and years. And technically all that stuff should have been under lock and key. But, well, at least it was confidential. Okay, so now we're going to talk about ethical issues involving non-human subjects in research. And that means basically research involving animals. Okay, it's sad that this happens, but yeah, there are guidelines for that, and they're not as strict as the ones for humans. Okay, it's different. Okay, but there are guidelines that have to be followed. So we're going to talk about what are the major elements of the APA ethical guidelines for non-human subjects in research, and what are the purposes and responsibilities of the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. That is what the committee is called. Okay, not the Institutional Review Board. That's for human research. For animals, it's called the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. That would be the group of people who are reviewing research where animals are going to be used. And you might end up doing research like this if you're going to be doing research that involves the brain or medicine or a whole bunch of different things. And it's not just psychology, it's not just medicine. All kinds of fields out there will use animals in research, even the cosmetic industry. You maybe didn't know that, but they do. But yeah, they have to test things on, sometimes have to test things on animals to make sure it's safe for humans. And there's a lot of research that's done with animals. that you couldn't do with humans. Okay, the debate about using animals in research, yes, there is debate about this. Is it ethical to use animals in behavioral research? I can tell you that according to the guidelines, that, you know, according to what is ethical is basically what is allowable by law, or if you follow the rules. And yes, it is allowed, so I guess they consider it ethical, but it may not be moral. Okay, it may not be right to you personally. It's ethical to use animals according to the guidelines, but morally you might be against it. Okay. Why do researchers use non-human subjects, or why, you know, and when we're talking about non-human subjects, we refer to animals, and in this case, they really are subjects. Okay, they're subjected to something. They really do not give consent. Okay, they are not participants. They are subjects. There's a difference there, which is why we don't really call human participants subjects anymore. And I might have still had some of those terms in there, you know, referred to human participants as subjects. That's outdated terminology. It should just be participants now. Why would researchers want to use animals for research? Well, to understand animals for their own sake. So for instance, are other animals capable of language, you know, like chimpanzees or parrots or things like that? You guys might have heard of that. They can talk, they can mimic, you know, the human voice. You know, or to understand humans via generalization from animals. You know, they can study, relationships and chimpanzees to understand humans. It's kind of really messed up to think about, but you know, what happens when you separate, let's say, an infant from its mother? You know, you can't really do that with humans, but they'll do that with, you know, with something like a monkey or a chimpanzee to see how the infant then suffers or what happens to the mother. And yeah, there's some really messed up things like that. And keep in mind that research is becoming harder and harder to do. There's a lot of things that they used to be able to do with animals that they may not be able to do now. I'm not an expert in this area. I didn't do research with animals, but I'm sure the guidelines have gotten stricter. But yes, they've done a lot of horrible things. But it's, you know, some of it is to understand what's happening with humans or what's likely to result with humans. Conduct research that is impossible to conduct with human subjects. Like I said, they can do things to animals you can't do with humans. You can't take somebody's child away, right? If, you know, when you're studying human beings, you can't deliberately, you know, subject some human to harm, but, you know, you can do that with animals. They'll do things like that, you know, even kill them, you know, as long as they follow the guidelines, but you can't do that to humans. There are organizations that protect the welfare of animal subjects. There's a whole bunch of them. There's the U.S. government principles for the utilization and care of vertebrate animals used in testing, research, and training. That's one organization. The American Association for Laboratory Animal Science. Okay, American Association for Accreditation of Laboratory Animal Care. Okay, so there's all these organizations, and there are more. Some are at the federal level, and some are at the state level, and some are at the, you know, local level. But what happens is if you follow the guidelines of your local guidelines, like if you follow, let's say, the APA guidelines of the Animal Care and Use Committee, you'll often meet all these other guidelines as well. As long as the ones you follow are the strictest ones, then all those will be taken care of as well. Because otherwise, there's just too much to keep track of. Federal government regulation of non-human subjects in research. The federal government requires researchers using non-human subjects to follow the guidelines of their local institutional animal care and use committee. That's the IACUC, right? And that usually will have strict enough guidelines so that the other guidelines are also met at the same time. But also follow the U.S. Department of Agriculture guidelines. You know, keep in mind there are animals that are, you know, grown for consumption and slaughtered and things like that, and they have guidelines they have to follow too. And those guidelines are not as strict as you would follow as a researcher. The guidelines of state agencies establish guidelines within the academic discipline of the researcher. You know, if it's psychology, it would be the AICUC, but if you're in some other discipline, it would be called something else. And usually the guidelines within the discipline, like I said, are usually strict enough so you meet the other guidelines when you follow, you know, the ones that you have to follow for your discipline. It's messed up they do this, but it's, you know, it's by law, it's considered ethical, okay? And APA ethical principles for humane care and use of animals in research. So there are some guidelines We won't go over this in as much detail as the ones for human subjects. When I actually took research methods in college, they didn't even care to tell us anything about doing research with animals. They didn't even bother, okay, to go over those ethics. But I think it's important that you should know that there are ethical guidelines, for animals in research as well. So the APA ethical principles for humane care and use of animals in research, you see table 4.4, you can see a description there of the guidelines, okay, and in kind of an outline form. It includes the general care and maintenance of animal subjects. Yes, you do have to care for them, and you have to, and there's maintenance involved. There's things that you don't do when you use humans for research, but with animals, there's other things that are involved. Housing conditions, food, sanitation, medical care for the animals being used, all that is part of the guidelines. The Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee reviews and approves all of the institutional research using animal subjects. Okay, so there's a group of people who reviews this research. And here are some of the, the guidelines here. But, there's guidelines about how you acquire, care, use and dispose of the animals. You can't just go capture, some stray cat out there and decide to use that cat for research. They used to allow that in the past, by the way, decades ago. You used to be able to capture, the animals yourself and go ahead and capture those rats or cats that are out there. And now you actually get them from certain places where they, they breed them and they grow them for those purposes, which I know is really messed up, right? Psychologists also, like with research on humans, psychologists have to be trained in those methods. You can't just have anybody doing the research, because that would be subjecting the animals to unnecessary harm when you have someone who doesn't know what they're doing. All individuals under the supervision of psychologists, have to make sure that they're trained. That goes along with that. Reasonable efforts to minimize discomfort, infection, illness, pain, all that stuff. Yes, so there is medical care and things like that. Minimize discomfort, right? If you use a procedure where animals are subjected to pain, stress, or privation, where you deprive them of certain things, right? That you make sure that you only do that when other methods are not available, when you can't do otherwise, basically. If you perform surgical procedures, you have to use anesthesia and things like that. You can't just say, hey, there's animals, they don't need anesthesia for these animals, right? And the last one, if you have to terminate the animal's life, right, you have to kill them, right, then you do so quickly. Try to minimize the discomfort as much as you can, or make it happen quickly. I know that's really messed up, right? But it does happen. All right, now let's talk about something a little bit less interesting, because I know that was difficult to hear. Right, we're going to talk about fraud now and scientific integrity. There are issues, that have to do with fraud and scientific integrity, and that's part of ethics and being ethical. Okay, we're going to talk about what fraud is and how it can be prevented. We're going to talk about plagiarism and how that can be avoided. Okay, fraud in science. First of all, what is fraud? Fraud is the explicit effort of a researcher to falsify or misrepresent data, where they willingly basically fake the numbers or write up the report in a way that is not accurate. That is considered fraud. Okay, why would researchers do that? Why would they commit fraud? Well, to remain competitive in their academic environment, right? The more publications you have, the better your chances of getting a job and getting a job in a place that is prestigious. Okay, it depends on where you work. At community colleges, they don't really require publications. Okay, but if you're going to work, usually at some Cal States, they require that you have publications. If you're going to work there as if you can be a professor, something like that. And some state colleges do not. Some require publications, some do not. It depends on how prestigious the state college is. But when you're at the university level, at the higher levels, they all require publications, and it's very, very competitive. Okay, there's a lot of applicants, and only the very best will get interviews, and then only the one that they deem to be the most qualified will get the job. There's not a ton of openings. Okay, it's really a privilege to be a professor at a full-time professor, by the way, at any institution, especially the ones that do research. So again, why would researchers want to commit fraud? Also concerned that if their research is not published, they may fail to earn tenure, even if they are already have been hired. If they work at a prestigious institution, there's a requirement that they publish a certain number of research articles in a certain number of years. They might have to publish, you know, maybe like 5 in 5 years, or 10 in a period of 5 years. So they have to publish, okay? And not everything gets published, by the way. They do research, and if it gets published, good, but sometimes the research doesn't work out the way they planned, and that's not gonna get published. But you know, people who know what they're doing, who are really good at doing research, pretty much everything they do is gonna get published. But it's a lot of work, and they have to remain competitive. There's this term within the academic discipline, researchers know about this. It's called publish or perish. In other words, you have to publish, you know, research that you've done and stuff like that to make a name for yourself, or you're going to perish, or you're not going to get a job, and you're not going to be well known, and it's just the way it is. That's the way it is. I'll tell you, publications were not required to teach at a community college. When I applied here, I didn't need to have any publications. I had some, and that just made me look better, but it's not necessary. Okay. But yeah, you know, if I would have been, you know, a lot better at what I was doing, I could have worked at a, you know, a more prestigious place, but it's just not how it worked out. Okay. And that's just not to minimize my efforts, but, you know, hey, I'm the first in my, of my family to actually go and get a PhD. Okay. I'm the very, and I've done what I can, you know, who knows, maybe my children will do better, or maybe they'll do worse. I've gone pretty far. Okay. But it's hard to be competitive. You're competing a lot against a lot of productive, very smart people in the field. And if you're going to work at UCLA, USC as a full-time professor and get tenure and all that stuff, or you work at Harvard or something like that, you're going to be basically a big shot. And, you know, it's very competitive. And I'm just not at their level. That's just simply to put it simply. Safeguards to prevent fraud. How do we prevent fraud? Experimental research studies are designed to be replicated. So when you do experiments, you know, there's a way in which it's written. It describes how it was done and what you found. And other researchers can actually try to replicate your study, do it in a similar way, and see if they find the same thing. And if they don't find the same thing, and let's say you're the only one who found a certain result, and a bunch of other studies find something different, then that means that what you did maybe wasn't done right, or maybe you faked it, it's fraud. You know, that might be a hint that this person is probably not being honest, okay? Research articles are peer-reviewed by experts in the field. Before your work gets published, you know, a bunch of experts are going to review it. And I'm not talking about the IRB committee here. I'm talking about after the research is done and you want a certain academic journal to publish it. There are experts in the field who are going to review it and look at it and see if it's worthy of publication. Maybe you did everything right, but they determined that what you've shown, you know, the contribution to science is really not that big a deal, and they're not going to publish it because it doesn't really add anything new. There are very prestigious academic journals, and there's less prestigious ones. Consequences of being found guilty of fraud. It's a big deterrent if you're found guilty of fraud, right? You can be fired from your job, right? You know, they can take away your degree, take away your funding. You know, a lot of times you get funding to do research, and if they find out that you've been faking things, they can take away the funding and actually demand that you repay it. And it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars that you might have to repay. So it's a big deterrent there. And there is fraud. There is fraud that happens in science, and every now and then somebody gets caught. But the vast majority of researchers out there are doing honest work, okay? But there are people who do commit fraud. And every now and then it comes up on the news that so-and-so was a big fraud, and that they were faking stuff. Plagiarism. Plagiarism is another form of fraud. It's not as serious as faking the research, but it is still serious, and you need to know how to avoid plagiarism. So plagiarism is the unethical representation of somebody else's ideas or words as your own. So in other words, you wrote something and you're basically just saying that you're the one who came up with that. And in reality, you're just copying what somebody else said. Now, maybe you didn't copy it word for word, but you're saying the same thing. And it's not your ideas, it's not your own work. Okay, that's plagiarism. It can occur on a variety of different levels, from outright cutting and pasting to at a lower level where you said everything in your own words, but it's still not your idea, and you didn't give credit to the author. It might have been done deliberately, where you did it deliberately, where you knew what you were doing and you're plagiarizing, or maybe you did it without realizing it. It happens. It's often when you work for a lab and you know about the other people's work in there, and you talk with each other, you read each other's work. After a while, you develop a certain language that they all use in the lab, and all the kind of researchers or the graduate students kind of sound the same, because we read the same stuff. And by the way, what you read determines kind of how you write. So after a while, you all sound similar in the way you write. And sometimes you plagiarize without realizing it, but you say something that was said somewhere else that somebody else wrote because you've read it, but you work with that person, but at the same time, you didn't give them credit. There are guidelines to help prevent plagiarism, right? There's many guidelines, but here's one book, Myers and Hansen, 2006. They probably have a newer edition now. I mean, that was more than 10 years ago. I'm sure there's a newer edition now, because the APA guidelines change, even for citing and referencing. So I'm sure this book has been updated as well. I haven't bothered to find the updated edition or two, but there's more than one. Guidelines to prevent plagiarism. Here's some guidelines. You don't have to actually go read that book. One is take complete notes, okay, including citations. So when you do your search and you find things that are useful, take notes, okay? You might want to highlight the sections that are important, and then take that and then write it in your own words, and still have a citation there. Have the author's name, right, and the year in which it was published, and keep track of things. Take careful notes, okay, so you know where things are coming from. Don't just write things down and then later on you forget where it came from, so you just write it as if you're the one who came up with that, or you're the one who did that work, and that's plagiarism. Identify sources for ideas, words that are not your own, okay? There are things that don't have to be cited. That's common knowledge. Things like, depression is a psychological disorder. You don't need to cite that. But if you give a specific definition of depression, right, that is in a certain book or article, then you have to cite that, okay? Maybe you use a direct quote, okay, where you quote something. Make sure you quote correctly, okay? Quotes, by the way, are used rarely when it comes to, in psychology, APA style. Yes, there is a way to quote, but the vast majority of the research articles you're going to read, you'll almost never see quotes. It just doesn't happen that much. Paraphrase correctly, right? Use your own words. Give credit to the authors, like I said. Include references too. Keep track of your references. You're going to need them, okay? If in doubt, cite. If you're not sure whether something needs to be cited, whether it's common knowledge or if it's something that you need to cite, if you don't know, then just cite, okay? I will penalize you if you don't cite something that should have been cited, but I may not penalize you if you cited something that wasn't necessary. I prefer that you cite than you don't. That doesn't mean that everything should be cited, but if you're not sure, then go ahead and cite. But things that are common knowledge, you don't have to cite. Depression is a psychological disorder. There's the sun gives off a lot of energy every year, right? That doesn't need to be cited. But if you say something like the sun gives, so many billion, measurements of energy every year, that's a specific number. Somebody did some research and they found the number. You have to cite that, okay? So it's an art. It's something you learn over time. What needs to be cited, what doesn't. But you have to be careful with that. Otherwise, it's fraud. What is acceptable and what's not acceptable? Here's some guidelines, some more guidelines. Repeating large sections of the text verbatim, that means word for word, is plagiarize. Even if you cite, if you just have large sections of the paper that were written in somewhere else, even if you put it in your own words, even if you cite it, that's plagiarism, okay? You can't just write the same thing that somebody else has written, even if it is in your own words, even if you do give credit. Changing a few words is still plagiarism, even if you have a citation, okay? Changing most of the word, but keeping the same structure and order of ideas, still plagiarism, even with a citation. Rephrasing, putting things in your own words, using your own structure, that means that you write it your own way in the paper, like maybe the order is different or the way it's presented is different, and using a citation, right? That is not plagiarism. So you have to write things in your own way, okay? You can't just follow the same structure that an article follows. Like, let's say maybe first they talk about causes of depression, and then and then symptoms, and then treatments, and you do the same thing. That's plagiarism. Okay, that's it. I am going to stop there.